Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Malazan Authors, Erikson Esslemont and Steven Erikson. Hello, Cameron. How are you?
Hello. Hi. Thank you, AP, for the invitation.
And Steve. Hello.
Hi, AP.
It's I'm always worried because he's a troublemaker. He is.
Watch out for that guy.
So today I thought we would have a chat about obviously one of my favorite topics, which is adaptation, about changing a narrative from one form into another and some of the processes that go into the decisions that get made. And I thought it'd be really interesting because both of you started out writing screenplays, and then there was the adaptation of some screenplay material into novels, and then thinking about using historical information and how you then change that into fantasy, the different tensions that arise. And so I thought a nice example would be adapting Arthurian myth. So are the two of you up for that?
No, just kidding. Yeah,
My
absolutely.
goodness.
And of course, even before sort of we even approach the Arthurian myth, then we have to decide what kind of genre we're looking at. Is this going to be fantasy or historical, or historical with mystical elements to it? All of those decisions sort of have to come in first before we can even look at the actual material itself. I think that's sort of my opening gambit on this one.
Cam?
I would be interested in knowing what our approach is, like if it's historical, how realistic, quote unquote, is the goal to be to the actual material. If it's in late Roman or post-Roman, Germanic, what period exactly are we looking at setting it in?
And I think this is a good example because quite often when we think of Arthurian myth and we think of, the Knights of the Round Table, the common image that gets sort of perpetrated is the full plate and the long swords, riding around on chargers, the quest for the Holy Grail. And there's an awful lot of much later period crusade imagery and time period being used. But when you think of Arthurian myth, it extends much further back in time because it has been written and rewritten and adapted and changed and added to over multiple different time periods until there's no one, the true myth, the true legend, the original. And so when we talk about time period, like Steve, what are you thinking in terms of deciding on a time period for the beginning of it? Like, how would we even approach this?
Okay, what is the earliest documentation that is clearly referencing Arthur and that story?
It's early Celtic mythology that was adapted into the matter of Britain. So that's what, 9th century? Let me double check.
My familiarity of one is that it was picked up and used sort of as a piece of propaganda by the Breton Celtic peoples fighting against the invasions of the evil Germanic Angles and Saxons. And it was just sort of picked up and used as a sort of a handy piece of legend to inspire the troops and inspire the cultural heritage.
I underestimated how old the matter, or overestimated how old the Matter of Britain was. The Matter of Britain came out after the Matter of France, so it's actually begins in the 12th century. 12th century common era.
Yeah, because that's where chivalry sort of becomes infused as part of the cultural stratigraphy of the story. But you've still got sort of lingering pagan elements, I think, to some of this stuff. And then one has to think, well, okay, are you going to be true to the story, or are you going to be true to what is generally understood about history at a particular period in time. Because those are two different things, right? There's a lot of magic that goes on in the story, which I don't know. I've always had issues regarding being too dismissive of the sophistication of. You're frowning a lot, AP. Are you? Is you still? Yeah.
No, I'm listening.
Okay. Okay. The assumption that these early stories are told by people whose mental landscape, if you will, is simplistic. So in other words, they are very credulous regarding miracles, magic, and various other things, the presence of spirits. And we know better now because we're all grown up. And that kind of sort of attitude, I think, is one thing I would want to have an Arthurian story work against. So people understood metaphor for a long time. And so when these stories have these elements that stretch credulity, they must be there for another reason, because even a 5-year-old is skeptical, right? And a 5-year-old back then would have been skeptical, and a grown-up would have been even more skeptical. So, there's nothing about us cognitively that has changed in that time. So I think a kind of modern recognition of that would be useful for this kind of story.
Yeah. And particularly the model of the Iliad, where you have a story that is ostensibly set in the past, but has contemporaneous elements mixed in. So even though, let's say we refer to the matter of Britain in around 12th century, it's recalling much earlier stories that have been passed down and passed along. So if we were setting it pre-Roman, but because that's where a lot of these Celtic myths were, the Welsh myths and the Picts, the various Celtic tribes, that if we're setting it pre-Roman and then couching it in a later period that's post-Roman, how do you navigate that? Because these are pre-Roman stories that are being told in a post-Roman period. How does that affect things?
Yeah, and pre-Roman would mean pre-Christian as well.
And even on that point, I think one of the assumptions about this time period is that it was very, very isolated, but it really wasn't, because you had all of the Celtic tribes in the area raiding each other. St. Patrick, no one knows quite where St. Patrick was born. It could have been like one of a bunch of different places. Ended up in Ireland for a while, then went to France, was trained in France, and then came back to Ireland. There was clear movement, even in whatever it was, like the 6th or 7th century. A lot of movement between these areas.
It's coming to light as well that there's a lot of trade.
Yeah.
There was a lot of exchange of artifacts and ideas and materials over a broad range of Northern Europe, down into Southern Europe. There were these trade networks that existed, even pre-Roman, and that there was also movement of people. And so there was a lot more mixing of different peoples and groups than I think that we now ascribe to the period.
Yeah, I think that whole notion of homogeneity in Europe is just nonsense. It's probably never been there. You go back far enough, you're looking at examples like the Cheddar Man, and the physical reconstructions of Cheddar Man make it very clear that there's the things that we would normally identify as quasi-European are nothing like we think, and it's a lot more complicated. So I think that would be one thing I would really push for, would be as much diversity in the casting as possible, just to reflect that there's
Roman.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, just think of Roman descriptions of Picts, the dark Picts. I mean, was that metaphorical? Was it, or was there an actual element to that?
Yeah.
And in fact, if you were setting an Arthurian adaptation, like they did with, I think it was the film King Arthur, with Keira Knightley was in it as a longbow archer, and Clive Owen. But I think Clive Owen played Arturius, because Arthur is described as a Roman and a Briton.
Yeah.
And if you set it after the sort of post-Roman period, because that's before the establishment of a lot of the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. None of that has been settled. It's a lot of tribal warfare. It gives you that range to set up different kings and kingdoms, all sort of within it, because it's the clan structure. And it would, I think, be quite an arresting time period, because you could have old Roman settlements, Roman style houses that had been built are the palace, because and we know this, that Roman architecture was extremely well done. It was long lived. So a mere 200 years after the Romans have left, you could have all of these sort of artifacts left over. And if the Romans had good swords, that these are being handed down in the intervening generations, which gives us a rationale for Excalibur, or the magical swords maybe that get picked up, that they were of superior engineering.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably push Excalibur much further back to a very proto-Celtic, because the description
the Bronze Age, Iron Age transition.
Well, yeah, because the descriptions of it do not match with the gladius, for example. They're not short weapons. It's not a short weapon. So you've got all that kind of stuff. But one of the other things is that we know that the Roman province of Britain lost its legion at some point. We don't know whether that legion marched with one of the usurpers across to attempt to establish themselves as emperor in Rome. At least one did. But the last legion, we don't know. So, but we do know that from even graffiti on walls, and especially Hadrian's Wall, but other places, that those legions were a composite mix. And there was at one point you had Scythian horsemen were part of the I guess the Federati or whatever, the cavalry. And then at another point, you have North African members who are repairing and building on the wall. So then the question is, all right, if the provincial status simply dissolves and disappears, it doesn't mean everybody picks up their stuff and heads back home. They may well have married close, and they may well settle in wherever they are. So even there, you've got, even post-Roman, you've got immense diversity in the population. So I think if we're going to place it in that period, which is, I mean, some films have done it already. The Last Legion comes to mind. That, I think we'd have to make sure that we were reflecting that quite accurately, as accurately as we know now.
That's the point that I was going to make about the Roman expansion. Is it wasn't racially based. It was cultural expansion, and it was very cosmopolitan. Anyone could be a Roman as long as they Romanized, right? And so you had, and they just drew upon people from all over. And once they became officially Roman, they were free to travel through the whole empire.
And
it's very cosmopolitan.
And definitely elements of the military structure was designed to actually transplant recalcitrant peoples, within the army to places that they had no particular tie to, because that reduced the opportunity of rebellion. If you're a legion that's protecting your homeland, you're more likely to rebel than if it's a completely strange place where you're freezing cold because you came from North Africa, and Britain's not like that. So all those things, I think that kind of cultural flux needs to be in play for sure.
And was it the 9th century when the Vikings were raiding down into the Mediterranean, or was that slightly?
No, 9th century. It's about right. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, 700, 900.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the idea of like a whole bunch of pale English people being the cast doesn't really stand up to historic scrutiny, because there's a huge movement of, even with Viking raids into the Mediterranean and North Africa, of taking back slaves.
Yeah, they took wives, they captured women. Yeah.
The Celts obviously had been doing the same thing, so there's going to be evidence of that. The Roman settlements would have left certain people behind who from all over the Roman Empire. So I think even setting that up very as historically as we can make it, if we're going to try and make a very realistic history-based version of Arthur, setting up in the either pre-Roman or post-Roman, when everyone is left, setting up this story, you're going to have a very diverse cast, and it's not going to be particularly Anglo nor Saxon.
No, and it's not going to be particularly necessarily monotheistic either. So you'll have Christians, but with the influx, especially of some of the northern Germanic tribes, initially they come in, as we've seen at Sutton Hoo and places like that very much a pagan belief system, and it starts sort of blending and merging and produces Beowulf at some point. So, so you'd have a mix there, which means the landscape would have to include, I think even in the Roman period, churches were springing up on holy ground, on previously existing pagan holy ground, which was a tactic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd want that kind of interesting mix of the two, sort of blending together, and some of the older stories still having that resonance. So that would be, it'd be quite interesting that way.
You would even have different versions of Christianity, because there were various different interpretations existing all at the same time, and of course hating each other. That would be complex, and then you would have the existing pagan lines as well, continuing through, all mixed together.
And I'm thinking even then the different movements of the various Celtic tribes, because you could have a very strong Irish cast to this, and Welsh and Scottish and Cornish all coming in, because they're still predominantly the Celtic Britons, like they are
the Bretons. Yes.
Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of Celts running around in this time period. So that's an interesting dynamic that I think often gets overlooked, because we think of Arthur as very English, upper class English accents when we're dealing with these knights, and yet a lot of it coming from the Welsh myths, coming from various myths spread through that whole region. You're going back to a lot of Celtic mythology, and the movement of Celts backwards and forwards in this whole region, like that's very, very fluid. Strong trade ties as well as raiding. So there's a lot of movement going on, and I think it challenges a lot of the preconceptions we have about Arthur that we get from that almost post-Crusades vision of it, where we make these, and even then the Crusades were a fair bit more diverse, I think, than people sometimes give them credit for.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So if we're looking this far back, then as we discussed Excalibur, the whole idea of swords themselves, of course, would have been very rare, and just possessing such an item would have been very almost mystical to a lot of people who, for their whole life, never saw one. And that alone would infuse this object with all sorts of mystical significance.
And
Yeah,
that
it certainly seems to be, it's symbolic of royalty, however you want to define royalty.
Status.
Yeah.
high status thing found in a grave. Oh, look, it's a fancy sword. Um, but I think that brings up the really interesting dynamic then of the fantasy through to historicism, the idea of that sort of tension. The more fantastical you make it, could Merlin cast actual fireballs, or was it more he was more of a mystic and it was about omens and portents, and the belief was he was enacting magic, but for the modern audience it could be, oh well, it's more a belief, not actually doing things, all the way through to no, he just was a spiritual leader. That, you know, there are different ways of looking at those fantastical elements, because as soon as you start going, well, we're going to bend and go, no, he could actually summon a dragon. Okay, well, if you're adding dragons to it, we've moved away from historical accuracy, and now we're moving into the fantastical. Are we going to say that he was a wise man, a mystic, or he was an out and out wizard? He could do actual magic and create magical effects. Or try and find a middle ground where he was creating effects like, oh, I'm going to brew this will make you better. And it's because it's brewing the water, cleaning the water. So he's always using clean water so people don't get wounds infected. You know, there are different ways of looking at it. So where do you sort of come down in that tension?
Well, oh, go ahead,
Go ahead.
No, you started. Go ahead.
Well, let's look at the historical basis, the Druids. All right. You can draw upon those traditions and use them as a source material. And then depending on how far you want to go, you can, go as far as you wish, depending on your object for this adaptation. What are your goals? How far into the fantasy do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the spine of the story is all about prophecy, isn't it? It's about a kind of legacy that one is born into. So there are mythic elements that are in play that are kind of central to the story, and that includes the journeys of the various knights of the Round Table and all the rest. So if you want to sort of acknowledge that, then I think you kind of have to muddy the waters a little bit in terms of what's magic and what isn't, or what's magic and what's mundane. And I think sort of the area for there would be something like just basic mysticism of some form, some kind of Gnostic approach to this kind of thing, or hermetic.
Knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge, secret knowledge. For example, what is magic and what isn't? Who's to say? Let's say he knew the calendar and knew astronomy through astrology, and knew and prophesized a eclipse. All right. He says, in 7 days, the sun will disappear. And if someone says that to you and you've got no idea about the calendrical procedures, then that would seem like extraordinary magical ability.
Yeah. And there was a lot of Roman knowledge that was held on to, while a whole bunch of other stuff was lost.
Yeah, coming from the Greeks.
Yeah, so that stuff would have appeared not necessarily miraculous, but at least unusual enough to feel mystical in some fashion or another. And then you've got that whole thread of use of psychedelics, which probably predates the pagan or the Christian stuff by a long shot among all these tribes. And then you've got all these sort of ancillary archaeological details that tie into some of the mythology, which is we find a lot of sacrificed, if you will, items and objects, especially swords, which are ritually bent and thrown into the bogs. So bogs are important, and the Excalibur thing, and historically, who was it? Alfred the Great, after getting whooped, he ended up living in a swamp for a while. So I mean, there's yeah, those sort of mystical or mythical, quasi-mythical, but historically accurate aspects of the cultures that I think I would want to see sort of reflected in some fashion or another in a script like that.
Because for me, it's one of the most fascinating tensions in historical fantasy, because you can take an historical period, and as soon as you move it into the fantasy world where people can summon a dragon or talk to a dragon, like as soon as you've done that, you go, right, you've left historical accuracy behind to a certain extent. You can still use it as the framework or the backbone of the story, but you're now no longer bound by historical accuracy because you've started adding in expressive magic and dragons and all of these effects. But there is a way to do it where you can move back towards historical accuracy and you have the suggestion or the interpretation by the characters at the time that this is magic, even if we would look at it and go, well, that's just knowledge. That's just understanding how the calendar works, or that's a knowledge of understanding how the lunar cycle works. And
For
depending
others,
on where you fall on that,
the magic can be other. Someone could say, "Well, I'm going to take you to the door to hell," and so this individual leads this group to the edge of a bog, because the bogs were doorways to the underworld. And then we're going to communicate with the beings that are down there. We're going to give them gifts, or we're going to throw things in and can claim that things are coming back out. And there are all sorts of ways of doing this. This is, and it's not that they were more gullible, as Steve was saying. That's not because they weren't as sophisticated as us. It's just it was a different belief system.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find fascinating is I used to live in Liverpool, and around the coast in the Merseyside area, there are places where there is a natural oil leaks out onto the rocks of the cliff face, which you could theoretically set fire to because of the seepage from the various shale layers. So that's why fracking works. But there was oil residue on the side of the wall, and you can imagine someone going up and going, well, we're going to scrape off all of this stuff and it'll make a magical fire. And so, oh, you can't set fire to rock. Well, I just did. He's a magician. And there are ways of playing with the actual stratigraphy, the actual land and the features of the land that could create these strange effects. And people just go, wow, I've never seen it done that way. And it would be a slightly different way of approaching it. And this is what I find fascinating anytime they adapt Arthur, because let's face it, how many adaptations have we had of various Arthurian myths? But sometimes, like even with the King Arthur one, where they were the horsemen from the Roman army, and yet none of the buildings were Roman. And you go, but you lean into that, you have them, and they go, oh no, but an audience wouldn't believe that. They wouldn't believe that there's a Roman villa sitting in the middle of England. But it wasn't England then.
Go to Bath.
Yeah, go to Bath. No kidding.
Yeah, it's we like, if you've ever been, like, it's littered with all of these Roman buildings that have been there, and you go, why is none of that in it? It's because of this perception we have that, oh, it must be this way. And yet we know history. We can look at the historical record and go, yeah, it wasn't a bunch of English people. They hadn't colonized there yet. Yeah. There's a whole lot of Celts. There's a whole lot of ex-Romans. There's people from all over the Mediterranean and North Africa and all over Europe have all been living there. And some have left and some have stayed. Some have had families. People got kidnapped and enslaved by tribes in enforced indenture service and servitude. But then may have earned their freedom, may have joined that tribe, may have traveled back to their original tribe. The fluidity of that time period is so fascinating. And yet our common misconception always seems to cast these, oh yes, I am Arthur, king of the Britons.
Well, you can thank Monty Python for that. But it's interesting because right now there's a lot of rethinking regarding the so-called Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. And I guess one of the guys leading the charges is sort of the Gandalf of archaeology in Britain, a guy named Francis Pryor, who's pointing out that, you know, every time sort of an Anglo-Saxon settlement is excavated, there's no evidence of fighting. You know, they've just settled there. And so we don't know to the extent to which post-Roman Britain simply depopulated. We know plagues were ripping through the Western Empire and the East. So we're not quite, you know, there's the idea that your Welsh and your Cornish and indigenous Brits basically really never really moved around individually, or rather as a presence, as a population within areas. And genetic studies have certainly indicated that, yeah, some people just never left wherever they were.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know to the extent to which the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were moving into depopulated areas. Because if the farming broke down, and it's interesting because the things that can break things down in terms of the agriculture as an industry in Rome or the Roman Empire are really odd things. For example, read Samian pottery, the Roman stuff, which was basically industrially made. And the trade of that actually, you know, you can track it all over the Roman Empire, but you can also track when it ends. Because when that pottery starts disappearing, suddenly you start getting local pottery being made, and it's cruddy, it's rubbish, because it's almost as if the skills of pottery making have been lost by the population there. It'd be the equivalent of, you know, all of us in our towns, and suddenly, you know, those plates and cups and everything else that we're commonly using and breaking all the time and buying new stuff, suddenly you can't buy any new stuff anymore anywhere. You know, how many of us actually have the ability to throw a good pot? I don't mean throw it in the sense of at somebody's head, because we all have that ability, but you know, on a wheel or even not on a wheel. So skills are lost, and quite often it can be something as small as that can eventually lead somebody to abandoning the farm. And so there may be a case of the Anglo-Saxons and company simply repopulating places that had been depopulated. People had moved elsewhere, because it is strange that there's not nearly as much martial presence of the Angles and Saxons in terms of fighting somebody that you would think. So the so-called invasion may not have been invasion; it may just have been a population movement.
Oh, so that's a population movement.
Yeah,
and
migration.
Yeah, migration, but it would also be a mix going on among them with, say, we've talked about slavery, continued slavery, and those populations being drawn from elsewhere. So that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of the more of what we're looking at is a cultural colonization in a spread of a set of ideas that move through different populations.
That seems to be the new thinking now on the Anglo-Saxon stuff and the artwork, is that it may actually be indigenous populations picking up the cultural motifs of the Angles and the Saxons, because it looked cool. I mean, it did. It's really cool looking stuff. So
it's the original Keeping Up with the Joneses, because an Angle family moved in and they were all fancy, so like that's what our family did. We just copied them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting time period, and I think one of the mistakes that can be made when you're making this stuff is to assume that the history books you're reading are accurate, because they may not be. Right? Things are a lot more complicated and messy.
There's still this idea of the Gaelic fringe
Yeah.
The idea of the populations being pushed to the west, as if they all packed up their bags and left, right? And imagine there was some depopulation, yes, etc. But as in North America, the indigenous tribes saying, "Hey, no, wait, we're still here.
Yeah.
We haven't disappeared."
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is, when we do look at things like the Iliad, and we can clearly see in the descriptions elements from completely different centuries present in the story. And it's because, well, the conceit of, well, okay, this was an historical story, but it's for a contemporary or a modern audience. So I'm going to tell it in terms that they will understand. And then someone else, because it was an oral storytelling tradition, whether or not it was composed exclusively by Homer, or that's the name now given to the composition that eventually arrived, but told over time, adapted over time, and new elements get woven in that are utilizing things that your audience will recognize. And this idea of fidelity to a time period is, I think, almost relatively new in telling a lot of these mythic stories, because we didn't have a major issue with Crusade era technology and post-Roman era technology and pre-Roman technology all sort of appearing in the same story before now. But it's this desire for historical accuracy in a story that is myth, that is legend, that may have a kernel of truth based in a bunch of different things that happened, but have been extrapolated and changed over hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, we see it in other films. We don't have an issue with it. Think of Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade, when, he meets a crusader who's been, spoilers for everyone, but who's been sitting, with a sword almost in his lap for centuries. And then he poses challenges in a very, very Arthurian fashion. He poses challenges that, Indiana Jones has to best.
And they can understand each other, bizarrely enough.
Yeah.
and yet undergraduates will tell you, after having read Chaucer, that Chaucer, even though it is technically written in modern English, Chaucer's hard to understand. And we've had the great vowel shift, and then we have all the different dialects and changes even to our use of contractions.
Yes. Yeah. It's a good point, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just the idea that, I guess, to be too pedantic on the notion of historical accuracy is something we'd want to probably not even address in adapting the Arthurian stuff.
But I think it's one of the stumbling blocks that we have as readers, as consumers of film, is that we have in our heads an impression of what it should look like based on our knowledge of, or even our misremembering of, various things about the medieval time period or earlier. And because of that, it can harm our willing suspension of disbelief. You go, oh, well, that's not how the ancient Britons looked. You're like, how do you know? Oh, well, I look at Britain, it's full of English people. You're like, but it's a very diverse country. Oh, but it wasn't always. Well,
yeah, it was even
perhaps more diverse.
Yeah, I would think, especially the Roman era, it would have been incredibly diverse. And then you can go back further. I mean, we know that Carthaginians visited Cornwall. We know that possibly the Phoenicians were mining in Cornwall. So now, did they just arrive as traders and trade with the locals, or did they sometimes settle there? We don't even know, right? So, but that kind of movement is happening all the time, all over the place. So yeah, there's going to be, peculiarities of other cultures are going to be something, especially coastal towns, are going to be highly familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were no passports back then. People just went wherever the hell they wanted.
Wouldn't that be nice?
But and that's the thing that is like St. Patrick was what, 5th, 6th century, and was trained in France. and then came back to Ireland.
Which
And
implies an organized education system is actually
exists.
in place in France at that time.
Pre-existing. Yeah.
and that's 5th century. We're sort of assuming, oh no, but way back in the past they didn't know anything. And you go, but this was a guy who got kidnapped maybe from somewhere in Wales or in Scotland or somewhere in North England, got taken to Ireland, and then got freed in Ireland, and then got on a boat and went maybe back to England for a bit, but then ended up in France and got trained in France and then came back to Ireland. That's a lot of movement. And it's not one of those things that go, oh my God, he was in France. It's like, yeah, he was over in France. That's where he stood. Like, people were aware of this. And you go, if people are aware of it, if people understand that this sort of trade exists, and people from Ireland are turning up in France, you go, well, and just down the road from France, Spain, Portugal, and people in Spain and Portugal going across into North Africa, that I think there's far more movement and flexibility in these time periods than our modern sensibilities or preconceptions sometimes.
Yeah. Here's a great anecdote. This is about the Vandals. So the king of the Vandals named Igli, and he ended up, there's great stories about the Vandals. I mean, they fought battles all over the place. They ended up briefly, well, they started in southern Sweden, but ended up at one point near the Caucasus Mountains. And then they fought battles going back west. So I think at this point, Igli was either in northern Italy or northern Spain, possibly southern France. And they fought a battle, and King Igli got captured, and because the Vandals just kept losing everywhere they went. And the only record of what happens to him then is that he is exiled to England. And he's never heard from ever again. It kills me. It kills me. Yeah, it just sent off to the back of beyond. Right.
And this is what I find so fascinating about various adaptations of story is, like, these are all decisions that you make before you even start dealing with the where the story is going, what your beats are, what, like, this whole concept of setting. And in fantasy, people talk about world building all the time, and yet this is intrinsic to the setting of any story. If you're going to set it in Victorian England, you go, well, okay, did you choose Manchester or London? Manchester. Okay, were you looking at it from a working class perspective, or are you looking at it from an upper class perspective? Because that sets the world and the style of story and the direction of the narrative and certain points of view that the narrative is going to give weight to and not show, or things that, give weight to and show, or ignore and move on. That this all builds out the world of the story. And for something like Arthur, all of these are fundamental questions that go to, when are you setting it? Where are you setting it? What elements are you fudging? What elements are you going to try and stick to the true historic record of that time period? And if this is based on a set of myths and stories that could predate it by hundreds of years, and you're looking at only the 12th century version, which, from our vantage point, 12th century, it's all roughly the same back then. No, it's not. It's all radically different. But even looking at the 12th century version, where you have an amalgam of stuff that could be pre-BCE and stuff that is then part of the Common Era, all the way up to that time, because it was told to an audience of that time. And they would have used exactly the same techniques that we talk about authors using now, using archaisms to make things, to give things an authenticity of the past, or bringing in magic and spectacle because it's going to entertain their audience, and their audience will go, oh yes, but we're so much smarter now, we don't believe in that stuff. That these are all things that authors have been doing since the beginning of time. When, as soon as stories were being told, authors were messing with this. And so
absolutely. And in some ways, if you were to follow the traditions of recording these stories, the obvious continuity that you would apply to this is you would retell the Arthurian story in the modern era with a few elements of the antiquity sort of sprinkled in here and there, because that's basically what they were doing, right? 12th century, that's their modern era, so that's where they set
So a contemporary setting.
Yeah, contemporary setting.
And I think there was it Guy Ritchie did a sort of Arthurian story where they all spoke with the modern vernacular, but it was set in a pseudo Arthurian time period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, they went for the modern vernacular because again, this goes to translation and fantasy issues and historical issues as well. If you have people talking, common farm laborers speaking to one another, you go, if you look at historical records about how people spoke, you go, right, that would sound ridiculously formal and erudite quite often to the modern audience. But we want to try and get across that these are farmers. So what's the stereotypical way that farmers speak? Let's give them that vernacular. And we impose the modern concepts about how people should speak, what their level of education is, despite the fact that education and how we went about education was radically different back then.
Oh, and it just does such a disservice. I mean, take a look at the stump speeches of presidential candidates in the 1800s, traveling through these small towns in the United States. Holy crap. I mean, the diction level is high. It's high. Those speeches are complicated. They're not soundbite stuff. They're complicated arguments. And you'd have an audience out there who were farmers, ranchers, whatever, townsfolk. They understood everything that was being said, right? It's not the way it's thought about these days at all. Education levels were actually probably, in terms of diction, in terms of language and the written word, were probably better than they are now.
So, and also, but even how people taught, how people thought, how they experienced things. We might go, oh, that's a really long speech to listen to. You go, but think of the time period.
Enter your PIN to unlock the device.
Wow, that was so cool.
Speaking of new voices.
Yeah, listening all along.
But when we think of how we approach how storytelling works now, we're assuming a modern audience. But if we think back to how storytelling worked back then, Shakespeare wrote for commoners, for the plebs, for the urban proletariat. He wrote for everyone. And yet, I think if you ask the majority of students now about Shakespeare, oh, it's really complicated and it's really pretentious. But this, commoners, normal people, normal working people flocked to the theaters for this stuff, and they understood it. They weren't stupid.
They laughed at they actually laughed at the puns. Yeah, because it's a lot of puns.
And they could stand and listen to this and follow all of this because that's what they were used to. That was the base norm for how narratives functioned. And yet, as times have changed, how we approach narrative, the things that we value in it, the things that we say you must have, they shift and change over time. And so it's just every time we go back to, when someone goes back to remake Arthur, and you hear all of these strange complaints about, oh, well, it's not historically accurate enough. I'm like, well, what time period? When did the Arthur story happen?
And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of my favorite retellings of the Arthurian myth is Bernard Cornwell's trilogy. To me, and again, he's used a lot of historical accuracy as best one is able at that time period. But it was phenomenally good. And then you get things like, I don't know if you liked Excalibur or not. Do you remember Excalibur?
I vaguely remember Excalibur as being quite dark and frightening.
Yeah, but also a kind of I don't know, meta medieval. It's very, very strange. And the plate armor, well, yeah, the knightly armor was even stranger. Almost chrome. It was pretty cool, actually, but in some ways.
It was interesting. I liked it, even though it's not historically accurate. So
Yeah.
this what's the term? There's this gremlin that we have now that it has to be accurate. Well, I'm really have no time for that as an argument, because if what you're critiquing was actually really historically accurate, like truly so, you wouldn't understand a single thing they said.
And even the reference, but even if you have it's been translated into modern English, and so they're speaking their language, but we're hearing modern English. If that's the conceit that we're using, but even the analogies that they would use, we wouldn't understand. The metaphors that they would use, we quite possibly wouldn't understand, because the language has changed so radically that the signifiers and the signified have shifted, and things that are important have changed. Levels of technology, the assumptions that people make about the levels of technology at various periods in time is astonishing, because there's ebbs and flows of, there was, as Steve, as you had mentioned earlier about that particular style of pot, and it could be that a lot of it was being imported to England, or there was one place that made it, and then when they left, or it got burnt out, that was the end of it.
It becomes the end of things. Yeah, I mean, when everything broke down in North Africa, that's when that red glazed pottery, the beautiful stuff, that was dirt cheap because it was made in the hundreds of thousands. That just ended, and all trade ended, right? Because if you're not transporting goods, you're not going to risk going to sea. So that kind of breakdown it's felt everywhere, even though there may not be anything specific to that region that actually imposes that breakdown. It's come from somewhere else. That's what happens when empires fall apart. So.
Shortages and things break, it can't be fixed.
Yeah,
and you abandon it.
Yeah,
because
especially aqueducts and underfloor plumbing and all the rest. Yeah, if the knowledge is lost, you make do, and you end up with a shack in the woods.
And I think that's the thing that is always interesting with trying to bridge the gap between reader knowledge, viewer knowledge, or misinformation about something and the story that you're telling. That there's always a tension between the reader expectation and the reader idealized form of something and what the author is saying. And this willing suspension of disbelief is so important to allow for an author to tell a story in what they're trying to do. And if we fixate on quite surface level elements and we're not paying attention to the reason, the rationale that they're there or what is being explored, I think we lose a lot of what stories are telling us.
Yeah, I mean, going back to that idea of what these people from our past are going to look like, I think, if you have an issue regarding somebody's skin color of a mythical character, that says more about you than it actually does about that character. So it always just surprises me that becomes a source of critique.
And it's also an assumption that would even be important back then.
Yeah.
Who's to say they even gave it blankety,
Yeah, I mean, especially if you look at...
You're assuming that was important thousands of years ago, but it might not have been at all, not even an issue.
No.
Well, and on that note then, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on this. This has been fun and an interesting discussion. So Cam, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Steve,
Ricky.
as ever, a pleasure. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.